wonderful thing. No matter how filthy something gets, you can always clean it right up.
There were so many. I just gave them all what they wanted.
Yeah. But since when does anyone have a clue about what they want?
So what do I do?
Parting your soup is not a miracle, Bruce. It's a magic trick. A single mom who's working 2 jobs and still finds time to take her kid to soccer practice, that's a miracle. A teenager who says no to drugs and yes to an education, that's a miracle. People want me to do everything for them, when what they don't realize is they have the power. You want to see a miracle, son? Be the miracle.
And now actually going into the data, here's some demographic information on who the actual students were, as most previous research has used white Christian populations, whereas we had a larger percentage of Hispanic or Latin students in the Christian group and a large representation of South Asian students, right? Pakistani, Muslim, Indian, Bengali in the Muslim group. And both student groups were also closer in percentages related to being born in the US. I actually expected a lot more international students for the Muslim group, especially being in such a diverse city like Houston, so that kind of surprised me. Another very unique contribution, although I didn't do any sort of between group analysis because I didn't have enough samples, although this would be interesting, and for those researchers watching, this would be actually a very interesting area for religiosity and spirituality, the field of religiosity and spirituality to move towards, is looking at the sect affiliation. So as you can see, 60% of my Muslim group identified as belonging to the 4 different Sunni sects, with 24% identifying as Shia, and a large Catholic presence for the Christian student group. So it would have been interesting if I had enough of a sample, right? Like if I had funding, for example, and if I can guarantee $100 for each student, I would have had a much bigger sample, but I didn't have funding. If I had enough, I could have compared how Sunnis and Shias differed on these variables also, and I could have found something different, right? That would have been interesting. And here are the actual scales that I used. And again, you can watch part 1 of the video for a much clearer breakdown about the theory, literature, and rationale behind using these different assessments. I really went into that for the focus of that video. All right, now let's get to the results. Number 1, well-being. One of the most important contributions to doing any research study is novelty, right? You're asking yourself what hasn't been done before, and how can you build on previous theory to find new inroads for future researchers, right? So the research is always building on top of each other. Working at a well-being lab, we looked at both types of well-being. So psychometrically, theoretically, there are 2 major types of well-being: subjective well-being, which I spoke about, and eudaimonic well-being, which looks at broader aspects beyond just positive affect, life satisfaction. When we think about how happy you are, right? Just asking that question. Eudaimonic looks at broader factors: flourishment, purpose in life, self-mastery, actualization. Nothing was found for eudaimonic well-being, which is surprising, but there's some rationale. Number 1, the age of the participants. The mean age for both student groups was around 20 years old. So a question like which was asked on the eudaimonic well-being survey, I have found my true purpose in life. I mean, if you're 20 years old watching this, I know when I was 20 years old, that question I probably would have answered like a not at all on that question, right? But there was an interesting pattern for subjective well-being. Although it wasn't statistically significant, we also used Excel to plot the trend lines, right? So we had 2 different aspects to relay the same information to us. If I only looked at significant or non-significant, I wouldn't have this this visual depiction of what's happening, right? Which is another thing for I would suggest researchers to do. Look at data in a number of different ways, right? It makes for a much more interesting concrete depiction of what's going on. And plotting trend lines is also important when you have comparison groups across time with 2 or more groups. The subjective well-being hypothesis matched our trend line, right? Muslims began here, it dipped low during Ramadan, right? And then it went back up. But the interesting part was that at baseline, the Muslims are generally happier than Christian students, right? And you would expect a dip during Ramadan, right? It isn't easy to fast for 30 days with 13-hour fasts in the heat of Texas, right? But then you saw a return to baseline scores, as I've talked about in my lecture on this term, hedonic adaptation.
Destiny. I'm supposed to do this, damn it! Don't tell me what I can't do! Don't tell me what I can't...
One of the reasons why it's important for researchers, especially in religiosity and spirituality, right? Huge criticism of, I wouldn't say a criticism, right? It's just progress, right? We're always moving forward. Using single item indexes, right? How religious are you? That's usually how religion is conceptualized in many of these research studies. That's not giving you the robust picture, right? If I had just asked about well-being during Ramadan, I would have just had this image of very sad students walking around, but doing the pre-post give a more complete picture, right? And then also there's an interesting trend lines for the Christian students also, right? If I had just done the one measurement, I would have said, okay, the Christians are a lot more statistically significantly happier, but they went up and then they went below the Muslims, right? And the number of reasons as to why it went up and went back down. The first survey went out during finals. Maybe they were happy after finals going into the summer. A number of different reasons. And then related to eudaimonic well-being, right? Because there's a very high correlation between spirituality, right? And you can think about that, finding your purpose in life, your actualization, what you were meant to do, right? Those two tie in with each other in research. There were no shifts in spirituality. And this may have been due to the fact that I only used a single item measurement for spirituality. I asked, how important is your spirituality? Which is a bit too general, a bit too vague. I should have asked, maybe even used a multidimensional scale, similar to what I did for religiosity, where I used the PMIR, the psychological measure of Islamic religiosity by Abu Raya. Shout out to Abu Raya, who actually, I emailed him, he gave me his survey to do this research study. So the religious outcomes, this was very interesting. Previous research finds that Muslims are generally more religious, but what does that really tell us, right? Just like asking the question, X group is more happier than Y group, right? It's like, okay, that's giving us some information, but we really want to break that down, right? What are the components of happiness? Is it like materialistic standards, right? Is it like intrinsic motivation? Is it, connection to community? We want to have clearer indexes of what's causing these different correlations, right? I wanted to look at a much wider scope of religion to give a clear delineation as to the truth of that statement, because I hear it all the time. Muslims are more religious than other religious groups. First, so we had 6 different subdimensions, right? First, we had religious identification, being proud of one's religious heritage. Muslims were statistically much more religious on this category, although there wasn't a group by time interaction, right? So I was trying to look for group by time interactions. Which means that this effect was due to Ramadan. If we're looking at Ramadan as an intervention, we want to see whether there was a group by time interaction, right? So that the effect is due to that intervention, right? There was a main effect, meaning that Muslims are already more religious on this category. It's not due to Ramadan or any other time variable or extraneous variable happening. Our second subdimension, there wasn't a significance for religious conversion, although the sample was very small for this question because this was only asked to students who replied yes to a previous question. In my life, I have changed from a non-religious person to a religious person. It was a very small sample size, which is, you're not going to find a significant result if it doesn't exceed the sample that you need for a desired effect. Our third one was religious coping. There wasn't a significant group by time or main effect, which was interesting. I thought Ramadan would definitely increase this subdimension, but I was wrong, right? I thought positive religious coping, which is a very important concrete marker that's been found in lots of religious studies, right? Using religious through a utilitarian means, right? Religion helps us cope with the demands of the world that we live in, stress, anxiety, family pressures, communal pressures, right? Ramadan, we get closer to God. We're fasting more, we're praying more, we're with our community. This was the year before COVID too. That's important too, right? COVID really messed things up last Ramadan, but this was the year before COVID, so there was still that general pattern happening for most Muslims. But we didn't find an effect, right? That happens with research sometimes. Okay, our fourth one was, and this one was very close, right? We had a 0.05 cutoff for significance, and we found a 0.056 significance, so 0.06 shy of significance, meaning maybe with the larger sample, right? So I had 82, or I think I had 83 for the Muslim groups. If I had a bit larger, if all 150 students in the first survey had answered, maybe I would have found significance on religious struggle or doubting the existence of Allah or God. And it's important that for the Christian student group, I changed the language. I didn't use Allah, I didn't use Quran, I didn't use mosque, I used Christian language. But for our fifth dimension, there was a main effect for religious obligation, meaning that more Muslim students are reading the Quran as a daily activity, at least through Ramadan, than Christian students are reading the Bible. This is an important finding because moving away from solely operationalizing religiosity as self-reports, right? How religious are you, right? Oh, I'm very religious. Okay, let's move on with my day, right? So getting actual behavioral determinants gives a more robust picture, right? Muslims are more religiously proud and also are reading the Quran more, right? Although there were no group by time interactions for any of the religious subdimensions, right? And I'm going to speak a little bit more about the plausible rationale as to why some of the results that I hypothesized were not found.